Thank you. Let's make sure you can see my screen. And all righty. Did it come up? Yep. Just confirming that everyone can see my screen.
Yep, you're good to go.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us today on this Da Vinci update. I'm Dr. Viet Nguyen. I am a physician informaticist and the technical director for the HL7 Da Vinci Project. The goals for this session will be first to introduce those who are not familiar with Da Vinci briefly of our mission and why we were formed. Talk about the work we've done in the past year, which has actually been quite a bit, and give you an update on where we are on our use cases, as well as our implementation guides. And then briefly at the end, draw some links to what we've done in our implementation guides when the CMS and ONC final rules were announced last year, and how they're reflected in the final rules that came out earlier this year. So let's jump into this. And make sure that you can see. Okay, so the Da Vinci Project was formed a couple of years ago to address this transition we're having in healthcare from a fee-for-service, which is the dominant form of payment, to a value-based care system. And as most of you probably appreciate being in here at a HL7 conference, is that our traditional approach to sharing information is fairly chaotic, and it's point-to-point and not very efficient. And with the maturation of FHIR over the last few years, it was clear to the payer community that FHIR had reached a level of maturity that if they came together with the providers and the vendor community, we could create a set of standards to improve on the efficiency of data sharing between providers, payers, and patients as well. And we could use FHIR to do that. And our goal was to take the FHIR standard and identify a set of use cases and develop a set of implementation guides. And for those not familiar with implementation guides, I think of them as recipes or SOPs. Where you take the ingredients that are in the base standard and the profiles that are defined, such as with US Core, and put them into the context of a workflow so that the payers and providers and the patients understand how they can be implemented by the vendors in a consistent way. I use the metaphor that you can have a kitchen full of ingredients and a kitchen full of tools, but that doesn't make you a meal. So these implementation guides provide the recipe for putting together a consistent implementation of FHIR. And we recognize that the FHIR really provides us an opportunity to really connect the whole ecosystem, not just between providers and payers and patients, but all the additional stakeholders in the ecosystem. And over time, we see more and more, and especially here at DevDays each year, how each of the stakeholders are engaging and utilizing FHIR to improve interoperability and data sharing. So this is we call this our NASCAR slide of all of our current Da Vinci 2020 members. And as you can see, we have a number of providers, EHRs, payers, vendors, and a relatively new category of deployment members who are really going to help us scale FHIR to the HIE and clearinghouse community. So this is a timeline over the last couple of years. And as you can see here, in 2019, we had the release of the NPRM, the proposed rules from ONC and CMS. And originally in Da Vinci, we thought we would do 2 to 4 use cases a year in developing implementation guides. But with the topics that were described in the NPRM, we went ahead and identified key areas that we thought we should anticipate a rule and start developing some implementation guides. So over the course of the past year, we introduced 7 or 8 additional IGs, developed them through the HL7 and Da Vinci communities, submitted them for ballot through HL7's balloting process, tested them out at Connect-a-thons and a major demonstration at HIMSS earlier this year. And we are in the midst of ballot reconciliation for a number of them and expect to publish a number of these implementation guides this year. So here's a list of our use cases. And as you can see, we've grouped them to quality improvement, burden reduction, member access, clinical data exchange, and process improvement. And the ones that are in red are ones we believe are most closely aligned with the final rules, but all of these are in various stages of development. And with this next slide, we decided we'd use some dials to visually give you a sense of where they are in development. And as you can see, the dark gray use cases are actually already in a first version of publication. So they're there and ready to be picked up and are in kind of an improvement stage. What are we going to put in the next version of the guide? And then the dark gray ones are in the process of ballot reconciliation and getting ready for publishing. And then we have a few that are on deck for future work: chronic illness documentation, patient data exchange, laboratory reporting, and price cost transparency. We have gaps in care right now getting ready to go to ballot. So this is the key slide in terms of status regarding the use cases. In terms of the quality improvement use cases, the data exchange for quality measures has finished in STU1, but was really focused on FHIR STU3, and this STU2 version of this guide was focused on FHIR R4, and we expect to have it published by the end of the year. Related to the data exchange for quality measures is a sibling IG. It's actually going to be part of DEQM called Gaps in Care, and we expect to put that in the ballot in the fall, in the September ballot cycle. Around the burden reduction category, we have the coverage requirements discovery, and I'll explain each of these use cases after this slide. We are publishing this group at the end of this quarter and in the third quarter. So as you can see, we have a number of these all in the pretty mature process of ballot reconciliation and getting ready for publishing. The ones that are in planning are patient cost transparency, again, patient data exchange, lab reporting, and risk adjustment. So I put up this slide because it's really helpful to understand where Da Vinci fits in the context of the other FHIR accelerators. If you haven't heard the term FHIR accelerator, it's a designation given to a group that partners with HL7 to bring a community of interest around a particular domain or topic and form that community, fund the work, and identify a set of use cases and put it through the HL7 process to develop implementation guides. So the first one really, before the term FHIR accelerators existed, was really the Argonaut project, and their key deliverable early on has been the US core, but they're doing some additional work that you will see here at DevDays around subscriptions and bulk FHIR and other topics. But we also have the Karen Alliance that's focused on patient access and to payer and provider data. And then we have some newer ones, including Gravity, which looks at social determinants, and a newer one that's going to be announced relatively soon called Vulcan, which is around regulated pharma research. And we work, the FHIR accelerators formed under HL7 works with the FAST, or FHIR at Scale Task Force, convened by ONC, and FAST is looking at all the issues around scaling FHIR, such as identity, directory services, security. And so we work in collaboration in this community to really take FHIR from the use case specific approach, which is what Da Vinci does, to a scaling approach, which is what FAST does. So including our implementation guides, the other deliverable we create with each of these use cases is a reference implementation. And I know that that is a variable term for many folks, but the way I've described it is that it is an example of the operations and resources that are defined in the implementation guide, and showing both using FHIR servers as well as relatively simple UIs, how a user might see the interchange. And so we partner with Logica, formerly the Health Services platform consortium to create sandboxes where we put data and we create client applications as well as server applications to test our implementation guides at connectathons and other venues. So we're going to hop in now into the use cases. And I'm going to present the use cases in a little bit of a clinical story because I think it helps to better understand why these use cases are important. And the clinical journey that I'm going to describe is the one we used during HIMSS, where we had our Da Vinci members create applications and server functionality to communicate with one another. So a payer may do a data exchange and had to implement it in a way that they could exchange with multiple EHRs, and the same with the EHRs. And to me, that really is a demonstration that they all demonstrated the same functionality, and we could swap out payers and provider EHRs to demonstrate the same functionality. And that's really powerful because ultimately that's what we want to show, the benefit of interoperability. So this patient, Lara, is going through a journey where she moves to a new state, needs to establish care with a new provider, sees the new provider, and the provider needs to get information. The patient gets a referral, so there's a prior authorization, and then she gets hospitalized and does some follow-up. So with each of these steps, and I've pared it down quite a bit from what we did at HIMSS, we'll show you how each of these use cases fit in. So in the first set, the patient moves to the new location and they need to establish care with a new provider. One of the challenges for patients is finding a provider in their community that's on their plan. And so in this first step, we're going to show how our Da Vinci Payer Data Exchange Provider Directory, or PlanNet, supports that. And so in this example, the patient uses a third-party application. That application uses a FHIR API that is linked to the payer, and that via that payer's FHIR endpoint, the patient can, based on their plan, look for providers in their area. And the information that comes up is the provider's name, maybe their identifiers, their location, and from there, you can see if they are different tiers and on different plans. And with that, the patient can select a provider. During our HIMSS demo, we combined this with the Argonaut scheduling or FHIR scheduling API and showed how the patient not only can identify the provider, they can schedule a patient with that, schedule an appointment with that provider. And we could show how that was done from the patient's view as well as from the provider view when the new appointment is stored. So since this can be patient specific and identify a specific patient and specific plan, it can also be patient agnostic. So a third-party application can use the plan identifier and identify all the providers that are in that plan. And then you can augment that data with geospatial information based on a user's location. So this is very helpful because it enables a standard way to get provider information from a payer and then integrate that into workflow, because we could also use this provider directory inside the EHR with a Smart on FHIR app when you do a referral, because often you don't know who's in a patient's plan if you're the provider. And that happened to me all the time when I was practicing. So in our scenario, our patient has set up an appointment with a new provider. And with the transition to value-based care, more and more providers are in risk-based contracts with a payer. And one of the challenges for payers and providers is to establish and maintain that list of patients that are in that risk-based contract, because that goes directly to other activities such as closing gaps in care and quality measures and risk-based payment or value-based payments. And so we developed a risk-based contract member identification that we shortened it down to attribution implementation guide, where it allows a payer and a provider, once they've established a contract and defined who's in the list of patients in this that are affected by this contract, the provider can query the payer and obtain that list, and using bulk FHIR, download that list. And using that list, they would put that into their patient management tools in order to do outreach to patients. And so this is the first version. So in this member identification, we validated the first version and are working on this, the next version, which not only includes risk-based contracts, but will also involve fee-for-service type contracts, based similarly to the way CMS has done data at the point of care, where a Medicare provider, once they've seen a patient and have filed a claim, they establish a relationship with that patient and with CMS, and using that relationship can then request information on that patient, the clinical data. And so this is an important aspect of what we're doing for value-based care, and it's being implemented this year by Cambia up in the Pacific Northwest, as well as Humana. So we expect more updates and improvements, but we have a first version of this that can be picked up and implemented. So we have the patient established with the provider. The provider knows that they're on this risk-based contract, and the patient comes to see the provider for the first time. And one of the big challenges that a new provider has when they see a new patient is knowing what their history is. And traditionally, we have patients filling out forms, and patients can only know so much detail about their past history or their labs. But we want to be able to provide the clinical information for the clinician as comprehensively as possible so that they can help make good clinical decisions for the patient, both diagnostically and in interventions. And so we developed this payer data exchange. And in this payer data exchange, we use it both from a provider perspective and a patient perspective. In the provider perspective, a provider can request the clinical data available from the payer and have that sent to the EHR. And we demonstrated this in HIMSS in several different ways. One is we can do the request and receive the information as human readable information, which is helpful. But Cerner also demonstrated they could write some of this information back into the EHR, so then it becomes computable. And so the value of this payer data exchange is it makes the patient's clinical history more rich in order to make better informed clinical decisions on patients. And this is all based on the US core resources. And we expect payers to be implementing this this year and next year. And this is one of those that's related to the final rule. So the patient is now in the office. The provider has this past history via the payer data exchange and wants to know what quality measures, immunizations, screening tests, or chronic condition-based measures apply to that patient. So we are, along with that data exchange for quality measures, implementing this gaps in care IG. And in the gaps in care IG, the provider has a list of patients. It could be that risk-based contract list, or it could be a list that's created ad hoc for them based on their patient population. With that list, they can query the payer endpoint, FHIR endpoint, and ask for all the gaps in care. And what we're defining right now in the work is what is the basic list of information or input parameters that a provider may want to filter on this gaps in care information. And in the response will be that the same list, any applicable quality measures, and whether or not there's an open or closed gap. And what we're sorting out is what does it mean to have an open gap? Is it a gap that's approaching, or that you've missed the opportunity? But ultimately, the benefit here is to identify that the patient has a screening or an intervention, like an immunization, that's due, and gives them the opportunity to close that gap at the point of care. Or as a population, the health system can use this list to reach out to patients and get them in to close these gaps. So the idea here is to really intervene when the opportunity arises to provide the best care that we can for patients. And then along with the gaps in care, when the gap is closed, we use the data exchange for quality measures paradigm to send that quality measure information back to the payer or other stakeholders in order to report it and keep track of it. So once the patient's in the ER, in the provider's office, there's a number of other implementation guides that will apply that we can use. In our first example here, in our first visit, I'll often review the medications with the patient. And often we'll say, well, are you on the right medication? You're on the right dose. But another important thing is are there less expensive alternatives or generic alternatives? And so we developed this implementation guide in the family of payer data exchange called the formulary IG. And what this IG does is similar to the provider IG. It provides the payers formulary information in an open API. And so you can look at it for a specific patient, and that would have to be done securely, or you can look at by plan. And what the API does is that you can define the plan, you can add a list of medications if you wanted to based on the patient, and then return the cost of the medication, what tier the medication is in, and potentially alternatives. And this is helpful from the patient's point of view if they wanted to look at how much their cost for a medication is. It might be helpful to a patient if they wanted to look across multiple payers and to see which ones cover their medications or at what tier. And it could also be helpful to the provider implementing this open API in a Smart on Fire app in front of a patient to see if there are alternatives to the medications and find cheaper alternatives for the patient. So this is the formulary implementation guide. So I mentioned earlier, as part of the gaps in care, submitting the quality measure. So in our HIMSS example, we had our patient Lara recently turning 65 and needing a pneumococcal vaccination. The gaps in care IG and implementation would say that based on her age and the known history of her immunizations, she's due for a pneumovax. The provider orders and administers the pneumovax during the visit, and it's recorded in the EHR. And the way the EHR, one of the EHR vendors, eClinicalWorks, Allscripts did it, was to submit the immunization information on all the patients that day to the various payers. So they did a batch process. And by doing this quality measure exchange, we can keep the payer up to date to know when measures are closed. And then providers can also, with gaps in care, query to see what gaps are open. And then ultimately, with the transition of the quality measure paradigm into FHIR, we can batch all this information together and submit this information to quality measure authorities. So during the visit, we have the patient complaining of some chest pain and needing some further evaluation. She's stable, but the provider wants to order a stress echo because she has a history of osteoarthritis. And one of the challenges providers have is knowing whether or not something they order requires a prior authorization based on the patient and their coverage. So we developed 3 implementation guides that are all separate but related, that address this burden reduction around prior authorization. So the first is coverage requirements discovery. The second is documentation templates and coverage rules. And the third is prior authorization support. So the first 2, coverage requirements discovery, let's start with that one. You ask the question, do I need a prior authorization? So I will put in an order for a stress echo in the EHR using CDS hooks and knowing the patient's payer through their coverage resource, goes out to a payer's CDS service, and that CDS service will respond with a card. And that card will say, no prior auth needed. Or number 2, you need to do some documentation. Or number 3, yes, you need prior auth. If it's 2 or 3, you can put a link into the card that the provider can then click and opens a Smart on Fire app. And that Smart on Fire app would be based on this documentation, templates, and payer rules. And what that Smart app contains is really 2 major components. One is a questionnaire resource that the payer defines as the information they need in order to do a prior authorization. And the other is a CQL script, a clinical quality language, that matches the data requirements with a set of queries that the application can query the EHR and pre-populate that questionnaire and render it in the user interface, so that the provider doesn't have to enter information that's already available structured. And so with this application, we collect the available or needed information from the payers and the provider's perspective, and then you click submit. And the benefit here is that it brings this data requirements to the provider instead of having them look it up. It allows them to pre-populate it with structured information, so try to minimize their documentation tasks. And then it allows them to add any additional narrative and then submit it to the payer. And then once submitted, there's a transformation that's done because we have some HIPAA requirements for certain transactions. We package up the questionnaire and the FHIR resources, ultimately send them to the payer where there is adjudication, hopefully in real time, and it's sent back to the provider, and they are informed of whether or not the service is authorized. So we think this is really important in terms of reducing the burden of prior authorization for providers while maintaining a sense of appropriate documentation for services. So the patient has an abnormal echo and is referred to the cardiologist, and the cardiologist sees the patient, schedules a catheterization, does the procedure, and then bills for that procedure. And one of the things that often happens with payers is that they will do post-payment review. And they might do it because there's something peculiar in the claim, or they might just do it as a part of their normal auditing process. And so we developed an implementation guide called Clinical Data Exchange that allows the payer to request this information to support the claim, their post-payment review. And they do that via a FHIR approach where they define FHIR queries, essentially. If I know that, say, the patient has diabetes, I can specifically query for an observation with a loin code for hemoglobin A1C. And so we are in the midst of ballot reconciliation for CDex, this clinical data exchange, and are having conversations with the vendors because the original approach we did with communication and communication requests and communication may actually be better done with the task resource. So we're sorting this out, and this will go back to ballot in the fall, most likely. So she's had her catheterization. She does great. She's 65, decides she wants to join a Medicare Advantage plan. And with anytime a patient moves from one plan to another, one of the challenges is making sure that the new payer has all the clinical information necessary to have continuity of care, as well as potentially reauthorizing the treatments that were previously authorized by the original payer. Today, that's very cumbersome because often the new payer will ask the patient and their provider to submit all the same information to get a medication or a therapy reauthorized. The goal here is to have the patient authorize the sharing of that previous history with payer B to be sent to payer A, so that that clinical information can be used in automated adjudication and hopefully minimize the burden on the patient and the provider for sending clinical data, and hopefully minimize the risk of a break in the continuity of care for the patient. So that's the payer coverage decision exchange, PCDE, payer coverage decision exchange. So that's kind of the workflow of it. And the benefit is that it supports this continuity of care. It's active treatment. So it's not necessarily the entire history, but it is history for things that are being treated actively, you know, chronic medications or chronic therapies. And it includes diagnosis, treatments, any potential guidelines that the payer might have used, because payers use vendors for these guidelines. So if they happen to use the same vendor, it would also make it easier for them to reauthorize services. So we fast forward in time in this scenario, the patient worsens and she gets hospitalized for CHF. And we know that notifications is an important aspect of keeping the care team engaged in the patient's care and aware of when a patient gets admitted. So we created a notifications implementation guide that uses FHIR messaging to share that ADT information, admission, discharge, and transfer information between the provider and the care team. What we came to realize during the development of this implementation guide was that there was a new work being done by the Argonaut group around subscriptions and improving the way subscriptions worked. And so the decision here was to finish up this implementation guide for a FHIR messaging approach as we wait for the subscription approach to finish its balloting and its testing. And once it's at a point where it's published, we will revisit notifications and show how we would do ADT via the subscriptions approach. So again, this is sharing of the ADT information between the care team, which may be primary care providers, specialty care providers, other facilities, as well as the payer. So those are our implementation guides that we're focusing on here today. And with the interoperability rule, a number of our guides play a role. And for those who didn't participate in previous discussions around the final rule, it really impacts Medicare Advantage organizations, Medicaid, CHIP, and qualified health plans on the federal exchange. And for the ADT and notifications, it affects the conditions of participation for certain hospitals and facilities. And so the rule at a high level requires that the payers provide a standard API based on ONC's rules as well to make patient data available to the patient at their request. And so we found that there were really 4 IGs that were related to that. And this is the roadmap from CMS before they released their announcement regarding deferred enforcement, discretionary enforcement. And so many of these rules go into effect the beginning of next year, but discretionary enforcement has been delayed 6 months on a number of them. So this is a diagram that looks at the different exchanges between payers, patients, and providers. And I circled a few that relate to our guides. So as you can see, this up here, the provider to provider is affected by our alerts and notifications guide, as well as provider to payer. From payer to payer, we use the US core data for interoperability and the US core resources for continuity of treatment. And then between payers with a member authorization in the center of that will be the directory and the formulary implementation guides. So the remainder of this is really focused on this patient access APIs. They will be using the FHIR US core resources and really affect the CMS regulated payers. And this is a different view of that payer data exchange diagram that I showed earlier to put, instead of the patient, a third-party application that on the behalf of the patient gathers the information from the payers and makes it available to the patient at their request. So this may be initially claims data, similar to what the Karen Alliance does with the blue button, as well as clinical data as payers receive more and more clinical data via FHIR. This again is the provider directory via the third-party application, the formulary via the third-party application, but also potentially also available inside an application in the EHR. And this approach also, payer data exchange, allows the member to authorize their clinical data, not just the continuity of care data, but any potential data from the old payer to be sent to the new payer. So this is that member authorized exchange between payers. And then this is just a rehash of the payer coverage decision exchange, which is related but focused primarily on active treatments and continuity of coverage. And this is a brief summary of the notifications requirement for Medicare, conditions of participation in Medicare and Medicaid for hospitals and psychiatric hospitals and critical access hospitals. And really it's to include the demographics, the setting institution, and the diagnosis. And this is really important for coordination of care, both during that admission as well as afterwards. So this is, again, notifications. And these slides will be made available. We have a number of resources in Da Vinci to help folks get engaged. You don't have to be a Da Vinci member to take advantage of the guides we've built. They're all available here on the HL7 Confluence site. If you went to confluence.hl7.org, you'll find a link to Da Vinci. And when you get to the Da Vinci homepage, there's a link for this implementation guide dashboard. And it lists all of our IGs, the links to the IG itself, the project page, its current status, sponsoring work group, and reference implementation. So we try to make it as self-serve as possible for the implementer community to start developing applications against our guides. And if you want to know more about our guides and participate in our calls, we also have links to our use cases and call information on this page, as well as the HL7 conference call page. And we want to encourage folks to participate in connect-a-thons. We anticipate we'll have a implementation event later in the summer, probably before the working group meeting, where we're going to focus on a few of these ONC CMS related implementation guides, so that we can further educate you and do even a deeper dive into each of these guides, and then have an implementation event where you can see what people have done, and we can test these guides and further implement. So I am right on time. So I want to thank the organizers of DevDays, Firelane HL7, and our host. And I'll pause there for questions.
So Viet, we had a couple questions. One was about CDex and PDex being very similar technically, but the IG is slightly different. So the question was, why didn't we cover it with just one exchange, say PDex, and make the flow agnostic?
So PDex, the way to think about it is that it's payer-based information. And it's a similar FHIR APIs, so the ingredients are similar, but the workflow was different. And that's the main reason why they were separate. And for PDex, for the provider approach, we made it so it used CDS hooks, and providers could get that information automatically for the patient, versus CDex, which is a more defined request from the payer. Payers typically don't ask for everything that you have on a patient. They'll ask for very specific things for a specific reason. And our best example really is post-payment review or utilization management review. And so it's a narrower approach, but it uses the US core resources and the APIs. It's just the workflow is different. Does that help answer the question? I hope.
Yep. And then the provider directory, we had a question on whether this was going to be specifically developed by Da Vinci, or whether there's an existing healthcare directory IG that already exists, whether it's going to be based on that one.
Sure, it was based on the qualified healthcare provider directory, but we extended that in order to support what the additional requirements that were in the NPRM. So it was built on previous work.
Okay, that's all the questions that we, I know, hold on, one more just came in. Can you comment on patient visibility or control of what information flows from payers to providers? So,
well, the vast majority, if it goes to the patient, pretty much the patient has access, or I think this question is authorization, or is it a question of what data?
Yeah, I think it's more on control, so authorization of what data can be
so
in your examples, you show payers querying providers directly and vice versa. Like the patient would not have an opportunity to say, no, I don't want you to share that.
Sure. So that would be, that's at the policy layer. We have the ability in FHIR to do scopes, but typically when we talk about this CDex, we are talking about treatment, payment, and operations, the TPO aspects of data exchange between payers and providers. So if the example that comes up often is that patients may say, I want this visit related to an STI, sexually transmitted infection, and I don't want you to share this information with the payer. If the payer pays for the services, that becomes a little more tricky. If the patient self-pays, then their coverage for that visit has them as self-pay, and they are quote unquote the payer. So there wouldn't be an exchange. So I think we need to connect the layers between policy, workflow, and then how it's reflected in FHIR. We have the components available. We just need to make sure we have the use cases clear so that we can define some of those. And those are being asked in our implementation in use case calls. They are being addressed, and we have stakeholders that feel very strongly that they're addressed appropriately.
And a similar question around PDEX. Do you know of any restrictions of what providers should be excluded, i.e. sanctioned providers, certain addresses or phones? What information would be excluded?
From the provider directory?
Yes. Or, well, they said for PDEX, so for provider data exchange.
PDex is payer data exchange. I'm not sure. I know we have a lot of acronyms.
Do you want to provide maybe some more additional information, Kevin?
Yeah, what we're trying to do is compare like our directories that we support today for community and state Medicare and retirement through like machine readables. Mm-hmm. And so what we're trying to struggle with is, you know, we have an internal view of directory eligibility. So we don't display people who are sanctioned, only have addresses and phone numbers that you can call or that you can show up to. Oh. And so what we're trying to figure out is the difference between like what should we display as the CMS ruling in regards to PDEX rather than what we as a payer internally show or externally show for our members.
Yeah, I'm probably not the best qualified to answer that. I would think that assuming you got a clear response from CMS, if you wouldn't normally share provider information on sanctioned providers, then you may not provide it through this API. So,
okay, thanks.
Yeah, that's definitely at a policy kind of layer and how it reflects in the API. So we are over, and I want to thank everyone for joining today, and hopefully this was informative for everyone. And if you have any questions, you can reach me through the Da Vinci Confluence site, and I'll hand it back to you, folks at HL7 and FHIR.
Thanks, Viet. Thanks, John, and thanks everybody for attending. I'm stopping the recording.